It is the morning of December 7th, 1941, a quiet Sunday in paradise. The sun rises gently over the Hawaiian Islands, brushing the Pacific with golden light. Palm trees sway, the waves lap softly against the shore, and in the distance, the mighty silhouettes of American battleships glisten at anchor in Pearl Harbor. Sailors laugh, write letters home, sip their morning coffee, unaware that in just minutes history will change forever. Far beyond the horizon, across 6,000 miles of ocean, the engines of nearly 350 Japanese aircraft roar to life aboard 6 aircraft carriers slicing through the Pacific mist. The pilots, silent and determined, clutch small photographs of loved ones. Each man carries a nation's pride and a burden of destiny. The world stands on the edge of catastrophe. For years, Japan's hunger for empire had collided with America's growing influence in the Pacific. Sanctions had strangled Japan's economy. Oil supplies were vanishing, negotiations had stalled, and deep within Tokyo's war rooms, a chilling decision had been made. A strike so sudden, so devastating, it could cripple the United States in one morning. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor did not come from impulse, nor was it the act of madness many in the West would later believe. It was the result of long, simmering desperation, a slow boil that had been building for decades beneath the surface of Japanese ambition and Western suspicion. To understand the strike that would ignite the Pacific War, one must return to the 1930s, to a Japan rising swiftly yet perilously in power, caught between its dreams of empire and the cold reality of resource starvation. The story begins with an empire hemmed in by geography. Japan, a nation of islands, had industrialized at lightning speed after the Meiji Restoration, transforming itself from a feudal kingdom into a modern industrial power. Yet its factories, its ships, and its growing army depended on vital resources the islands themselves could not provide. Japan had almost no oil, few metal ores, and little natural rubber. Everything that fueled its industrial might, from the coal that powered its ships to the oil that fueled its planes, came from abroad. For decades, Japan's expansion into Asia had been driven by this simple fact: it had to secure resources or perish as a modern nation. By the time the 1930s dawned, Japan's eyes were fixed squarely on China and the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, claiming it was protecting its citizens and interests. In truth, it was the first major step toward an empire that would stretch from the northern plains of Asia to the islands of the South Pacific. The League of Nations condemned the aggression, but the world was wary, distracted by the Great Depression, and unwilling to act. When Japan walked out of the League in 1933, it marked not just defiance but transformation, a declaration that Japan would follow its own path, no matter the cost. At home, the military gained immense power. Civilian voices faded under the shadow of generals who promised destiny. Propaganda filled the airwaves, whispering of Japan's divine mission to liberate Asia from Western imperialism and build a new order under the banner of the rising sun. But behind the noble words was hunger. Japan's war in China, which began in 1937, devoured fuel, steel, and ammunition at an alarming rate. The nation's lifeline flowed from the United States, which supplied over 80% of Japan's oil. Every ship that sailed from Los Angeles or Texas Bay carried Japan's future in its tanks. Without those shipments, Japan's armies would grind to a halt. Then came 1940. The world was at war once more. Germany's blitzkrieg had shattered Europe, and France's colonies in Indochina lay vulnerable. Japan saw opportunity. As Hitler's armies marched across Europe, Japan struck deals of its own, signing the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, a military alliance that tied the fates of Tokyo, Berlin, and Rome together. To the United States, this was an ominous signal. Japan was no longer just an Asian power, it was aligning itself with the very forces tearing the world apart. In July 1941, the breaking point came. Japan occupied southern French Indochina, positioning itself to strike the Dutch East Indies, rich in oil and rubber. To President Franklin D. Roosevelt, this was a direct threat to Western interests in the Pacific. In response, the United States froze all Japanese assets and cut off the oil supply completely. Overnight, Japan's industrial heart began to suffocate. The empire had less than 2 years of fuel reserves left. Without oil, its ships could not sail, its planes could not fly, and its empire would collapse. The embargo was more than an economic measure. It was a chokehold. To Japan's leaders, it felt like a declaration of war in all but name. Inside Tokyo's Imperial Palace, the atmosphere turned grim. Every meeting of the Supreme War Council grew heavier, filled with tension between two factions. Those who sought peace and negotiation, and those who demanded action. The diplomats urged patience, pleading that diplomacy could restore trade if Japan compromised. But the generals, led by men like General Tojo Hideki, saw things differently. They believed that waiting meant weakness. Every passing month depleted their fuel reserves. Every shipment denied made their navy weaker. To them, Japan stood on a cliff's edge, and the only way forward was to leap before being pushed. While the diplomats sent messages to Washington, the military began quiet preparations. In naval bases from Kure to Yokosuka, officers met in secret rooms under dim light, spreading maps of the Pacific across long tables. Red circles marked strategic targets: Guam, the Philippines, Singapore, and one critical point in Hawaii, Pearl Harbor. Japan's naval intelligence knew the base was the home of America's Pacific Fleet. Destroy those ships, and Japan could dominate the Pacific unopposed, at least for a time. But to the American public, war still seemed distant. Most Americans saw Japan as a regional threat, not a global one. Isolationist sentiment ran deep. The horrors of the First World War still haunted the nation. Roosevelt faced a country reluctant to enter another foreign conflict. And so, while Japanese diplomats continued their talks, few imagined that Japan was already planning something unprecedented, an attack that would reach the heart of America's Pacific presence. In the war rooms of Tokyo, Japan's strategy solidified. If Japan could not convince the United States to lift its embargo, it would seize the resources it needed by force. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber plantations of Malaya, the tin mines of Burma. But first, the United States had to be neutralized. The plan was both bold and desperate: cripple America's Pacific Fleet with a surprise attack so devastating that Washington would be forced to negotiate. As autumn 1941 turned to winter, the atmosphere in Japan grew electric with quiet urgency. Every meeting was a balancing act between war and diplomacy. In late November, the final efforts at peace faltered. The U.S. demanded Japan withdraw from China and Indochina, terms Tokyo could not accept without losing face and power. The final telegrams exchanged between the two governments were cold, formal, and heavy with unspoken meaning. By the end of the month, Japan's fleet had already slipped into the Pacific. For the Japanese military, this was not mere aggression. It was, in their eyes, a fight for survival. They believed that if they did nothing, the United States would strangle them economically until surrender was inevitable. And yet, striking the first blow also meant sealing their fate. Deep within his quarters, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the attack, wrestled with doubt. He had studied in America, understood its industrial might, and once famously warned, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." But his duty was clear. Japan had chosen the path of no return. In naval yards across Japan, crews prepared aircraft, torpedoes, and bombs. Mechanics worked day and night, checking every engine, calibrating every weapon. Pilots studied their maps, memorizing the layout of Pearl Harbor, the positions of the battleships, the airfields, the fuel depots. The operation was to be one of precision, secrecy, and total surprise. Not even Japan's own diplomats in Washington knew the exact hour their country would go to war. The political justification was written as elegantly as the strategy was brutal. Japan would present peace terms up until the very moment of attack, ensuring America remained off guard. The fleet, 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, and dozens of support vessels, would cross the Pacific under radio silence, invisible in the vastness of the ocean. Every man aboard those ships knew that discovery would doom the mission. Every sailor carried the weight of history on his back. To the Japanese government, the embargo symbolized humiliation. In their worldview, Japan was the rightful leader of Asia, destined to free it from Western control. To accept the American demands was to surrender that destiny, to become, once again, a nation under foreign pressure. Pride, nationalism, and fear fused together into an iron will. They would strike before they could be strangled. In the last days before the attack, Tokyo was cloaked in winter calm. The city's streets were lit dimly under paper lanterns as people hurried through the cold. Few knew their empire stood on the brink of war with the most powerful industrial nation on earth. The radio carried messages of peace. The newspapers spoke of negotiations. Yet beneath the surface, in hidden naval command rooms, the fate of millions was already set. To the outside world, Japan appeared calm. But in the Imperial Palace, Emperor Hirohito listened as his advisors debated war and peace one final time. The military assured him the empire's survival depended on action. The emperor hesitated, but in the end, he gave consent. The next morning, coded messages were sent to the fleet already sailing in the Pacific. The order was clear: proceed as planned. The gears of destiny had locked into place. Across the Pacific, in the cold, black waters north of Hawaii, Japanese aircraft carriers sailed silently beneath the stars. Their decks were lined with bombers, their crews awake and restless. The men aboard knew they were about to commit an act that would echo through centuries. One that would bring glory or ruin to their homeland. Back in Tokyo, ministers still sent diplomatic messages to Washington, the final act in a carefully timed performance. The Americans would not receive Japan's formal notice of war until after the attack had already begun. The strike was to be total, swift, and shocking. A masterstroke that would leave the U.S. Navy crippled and its morale shattered. But beneath the cold calculation was something more human: fear, pride, and inevitability. Japan's leaders felt cornered, trapped between a rock and an empire. To yield would mean humiliation and decline. To fight was to risk annihilation. Yet in their minds, inaction was the greater sin, and so they chose to strike. It was not chaos. It was not impulse. It was a desperate empire making a final gamble, to destroy its enemy before being destroyed itself. The decision to attack Pearl Harbor was not born out of recklessness, but out of cold, strategic calculation. a grim gamble made in the name of survival. To Japan's leaders, it was the only path left when diplomacy failed and time ran out. They did not seek destruction, but advantage. They believed that with one decisive strike, they could cripple the United States long enough to secure the empire they had fought decades to build. It was a wager not just of weapons, but of destiny. A test of whether Japan's will and daring could overcome America's might. In the heart of Tokyo's Naval General Staff building, behind locked doors and drawn curtains, the architects of this gamble met in secret. Maps of the Pacific stretched across long tables, each island marked with red ink, each shipping route drawn with precision. At the center of the map, Pearl Harbor. The American Pacific Fleet. It was the sword that could cut Japan's advance to pieces, the wall that blocked its expansion southward toward the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. As long as that fleet lived, Japan could never move freely in the Pacific. Destroy it, and the path to empire would open like a gate. The plan that emerged was audacious. No other nation in modern history had attempted a naval air strike of such scale, across such distance, against such a target. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant yet reluctant commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, understood both its promise and peril. He was not a warmonger by nature. He had studied in the United States, attended Harvard, traveled through California, and admired American industry and spirit. He knew the vastness of America's factories, its boundless energy, its ability to turn peace into production and production into power. He feared it. And yet, he also understood Japan's position, that if America's navy were allowed to remain strong, Japan's empire would be strangled in its cradle. The mission Yamamoto devised was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It would rely on speed, precision, and above all, secrecy. 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi Koga-Soryu, Hiryu Shokoku, and Zui Koku, would form the core of the attack force. They would carry more than 300 aircraft, including torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. Escort ships, cruisers, and submarines would accompany them, forming a floating armada that would travel more than 3,000 miles across open ocean without being detected. Their objective: to strike Pearl Harbor at dawn, destroy the American fleet at anchor, and vanish before the United States could respond. The secrecy was absolute. Even within Japan's military, few knew the true details of the mission. Orders were sealed, radio silence was enforced. Every man chosen for the operation was sworn to secrecy under penalty of death. The fleet would sail north into the icy waters of the North Pacific, far from shipping lanes and prying eyes, before turning south toward Hawaii. It was a path of isolation and silence, a voyage through emptiness, where failure meant disaster and discovery meant doom. Yamamoto's subordinates, particularly Commander Minoru Genda and Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, fine-tuned the operational details. They studied every map, every photograph, every reconnaissance report of Pearl Harbor. They memorized the placement of the battleships: Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, Nevada, Tennessee, Maryland, Pennsylvania. They noted the airfields: Wheeler, Hickam, Ford Island, Canio, all to be struck in the opening minutes. The goal was not just destruction, but paralysis. The Americans must be unable to respond, unable even to comprehend what was happening before it was too late. Yamamoto's greatest concern was not whether the attack could succeed, but whether it could remain undetected. The Pacific was vast, but not empty. American reconnaissance planes, submarines, and radio operators kept constant watch. The Japanese fleet would have to maintain total silence. No lights, No signals, no transmissions. Each ship communicated through flag signals and written messages. Even the smallest radio leak could betray their position. As the weeks passed and the plan solidified, a strange duality filled the Japanese Navy, a mix of pride and dread. To the younger officers, this was a chance for glory, a bold stroke that would echo through history. To the older commanders, it felt like a final roll of the dice. Many understood what Yamamoto himself feared, that Japan's industrial capacity could never match America's. Even if the strike succeeded, it would awaken a fury that Japan could not withstand forever. But no one could turn back. Once the plan was approved by the Emperor, the wheels of fate began to spin unstoppable. By late November 1941, as diplomats in Washington exchanged messages with Secretary of State Cordell Hull, the Japanese strike force was already at sea. On the morning of November 26, Admiral Nagumo's fleet departed from Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands under grey skies and freezing wind. The men aboard waved farewell to a land they might never see again. For 2 weeks, they would sail through rough northern seas, unseen by the world. The aircraft were secured in their hangars, their wings folded, their engines quiet. The decks were covered in frost, and the air smelled of salt and steel. Inside the carrier Akoji, pilots gathered in small groups, listening as their commanders briefed them. They were told of their targets, their timing, their routes. Each pilot received a silk good luck flag inscribed with prayers from family and friends. Some wrote farewell letters, sealed in envelopes to be sent home if they did not return. Though none were ordered to die, all understood the risk. Flying over Pearl Harbor at dawn meant facing anti-aircraft fire, fighter resistance, and the possibility of never escaping alive. Back in Tokyo, Yamamoto received regular coded updates confirming that the fleet had remained undetected. Each message came as a brief, clinical report, the calm language of war planning concealing the weight of what was to come. The Admiral spent long hours in his quarters, staring at a map of the Pacific, running his finger from Japan to Hawaii, from Hawaii to California. He knew once the first bomb fell, there would be no peace for a generation. On December 1st, 1941, the Imperial Conference convened. The Emperor, dressed in military uniform, sat silently as his ministers presented the final plan for war. Foreign Minister Togo spoke of the failure of diplomacy, of the American embargo, of the nation's right to self-preservation. Prime Minister Tojo Hideki declared that Japan had no choice but to act. The Emperor gave his approval. The operation was set in motion. The fleet was ordered to proceed with Nitakayama Nobor Twahalod 8. Climb Mount Nitaka on December 8. It was the coded message to strike. While the fleet steamed toward its destiny, preparations continued on the home front. Aircraft mechanics tested engines and adjusted torpedo fins. Technicians modified torpedoes to run in Pearl Harbor's shallow waters, a feat previously thought impossible. Engineers developed armor-piercing bombs by converting old battleship shells. Every detail, every element of surprise was crafted with meticulous care. The Japanese High Command believed time was on their side, if they could act quickly. The attack was designed to buy 6 months of freedom, 6 months to seize the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, 6 months to fortify an empire so vast and so strong that America would find it too costly to fight back. Yamamoto himself admitted that beyond those 6 months, Japan's chances would fade. He was gambling on time and timing. The fleet moved silently through the Pacific. The men rarely spoke above a whisper. On the decks, The cold wind howled, and the ocean stretched endlessly in every direction. The only sound was the steady hum of engines below. Each sailor knew that if they were discovered, the mission, and perhaps the Empire, would be doomed. Yet each day passed without incident. No ships sighted them, no planes reported them. The ocean itself seemed to conspire in their favor. As they neared Hawaii, the atmosphere grew electric. The pilots rehearsed the attack one final time, studying the photographs and models of Pearl Harbor. They memorized their flight paths, their targets, the signals that would guide them through the chaos of battle. On December 6, the final orders were read aloud aboard each ship. The attack would begin at dawn. The message to the men was simple. The fate of the Empire rests upon this mission. That same night, across the ocean in Washington, American codebreakers intercepted portions of Japan's diplomatic messages, but failed to recognize the warning in time. Negotiations continued right up to the last hour. The Japanese embassy prepared to deliver a note ending diplomatic relations. But because of translation delays, it would not reach the U.S. government until after the bombs began to fall. The irony was cruel words of peace arriving in the midst of war. In the early hours of December 7, as Hawaii slept, Admiral Nagumo's fleet turned south. The carriers swung into the wind. On the decks, pilots climbed into their cockpits, engines roaring to life. The order was given: attack. The first wave of aircraft lifted from the decks like arrows in the dawn. Bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters rose into the pale morning sky, climbing through the clouds toward their target. As the planes disappeared into the horizon, the sailors below stood in silence, watching until the sound faded. Some prayed, others clenched their fists. They knew the moment would define not only their lives, but their nation's fate. For Yamamoto, miles away at his command post, the thought was somber. He had launched the greatest naval strike in history, and perhaps the greatest mistake. Though he hoped the attack would bring swift victory and force America to negotiate, he feared instead it would awaken something far more powerful than Japan could endure: the full wrath of the United States. The calculated gamble was now in motion, hurtling toward Pearl Harbor at 200 miles an hour. The Pacific winds carried with them the weight of empires, the echoes of ambition, and the silence before history's storm.